Imagine for a second that you are walking into your local pharmacy. You're there to pick up a specialized medication, maybe something for an autoimmune disorder or like a targeted therapy for a family member's rare disease.
Right, the kind of medication where you've been paying a high but generally predictable copay for years.
Exactly. But today, the pharmacist looks at the screen, grimaces, and tells you the price has just doubled completely overnight. And I mean, there hasn't been a sudden supply chain collapse. The factory didn't burn down.
Raw materials haven't vanished.
Yeah. The price doubled because of a single signature on a piece of paper sitting on a desk in Washington, D.C.
It's a jarring scenario. And, the most frustrating part for the consumer is the invisibility of the mechanism. You see the price tag, but you don't see the complex web of trade laws, the geopolitical leverage, or the executive maneuvering that actually changed the number on the register.
Which is exactly why we're doing this. We tend to think of government policy as this slow, grinding, highly visible debate in Congress, right? But today, we are looking at a fundamentally different kind of machinery.
Yeah, we really are.
We have gathered a sweeping, frankly massive stack of primary source documents straight from the White House, all dated around the spring of 2026. We are talking about executive orders, presidential memoranda, official proclamations, and the press releases that accompany them.
Right, the whole package.
And our mission for this deep dive into the source material is to act as mechanics for the government's plumbing. We need to read past the political framing, lift the floorboards, and meticulously analyze the actual mechanisms of these documents. Like, we want to uncover how these levers are pulled and who these policies truly impact.
Whether it's you, the everyday American just trying to pay bills, or wealthy business owners or multinational corporations. And before we get into the weeds here, it is absolutely crucial that we set some ground rules for you, the listener. The source material we are examining today comes directly from the Trump administration and contains highly charged political rhetoric.
Very highly charged.
Yeah, these are controversial policy directives that draw intense, visceral reactions from both ends of the political spectrum. So our role here is entirely impartial. We are not endorsing, defending, or opposing any viewpoints, policies, or political figures mentioned in these documents.
You're definitely not here to debate the morality of the policies.
Right. Our sole purpose is to decode the text, explain how these legal instruments physically function within the government, and analyze their real-world effects based strictly on the materials provided. We are looking at the ink on the page, the causality of the directives, and ultimately the mechanisms of power.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because when you sit down and read the stack of documents in a single sitting, the sheer volume of unilateral executive action is just staggering.
It really is.
In a matter of days and weeks, we are seeing attempts to reshape global supply chains, fundamentally alter the tax code, redefine how local state elections, and even like college football operate.
Yeah, the college sports one is wild.
It's crazy. And they're managing massive military operations and domestic agency funding without a single vote in Congress. So to understand how that much power is wielded, I think we have to start by looking at the most tangible aspect of American life, which is the economy.
That is the perfect starting point.
Specifically, we need to examine this administration's aggressive use of tariffs and tax codes to enforce its agenda.
Yeah, if we want to see the gap between the intent stated in a press release and the actual effect on the ground, the economic documents provide the clearest blueprint. Historically, tariffs are taxes placed on imported goods, designed to make foreign products more expensive so domestic products can compete.
Right.
But the documents from April 2026 showed the executive branch using tariffs not just to protect domestic industries, but as a coercive tool to force multinational corporations into bespoke legal agreements.
Okay, let's look at the pharmaceutical proclamation from April 2, 2026. The administration released a directive titled Adjusting Imports of Pharmaceuticals and Pharmaceutical Ingredients into the United States. And they are invoking Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962.
Yes.
Now, just to ground us, Section 232 is a Cold War-era law originally designed to protect things like steel and oil during national security crises, right?
Precisely. Section 232 allows the president to impose tariffs if the Department of Commerce determines that a certain import threatens to impair national security. Historically, it was used very sparingly, mostly for raw materials vital to military defense.
So using it to blanket tax patented pharmaceuticals and their chemical ingredients,
It's an incredibly expansive, novel interpretation of what constitutes a national security threat.
and the numbers in the text are huge. They're rolling out a 100% tariff on patented pharmaceuticals and their active ingredients. The press releases frame this as a massive win for supply chain resilience and protecting the working class from foreign reliance.
That's the framing, yeah.
But let's look at the mechanics. The text of the proclamation explicitly notes that as of 2025, approximately 53% of patented pharmaceutical products distributed domestically are produced outside the country.
Right, over half.
Furthermore, only 15% of patented active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs, the actual chemicals that make the drug work, are produced domestically.
So let's break down the mechanics of a supply chain to understand the effect here.
Yeah.
Imagine a pharmaceutical company that makes a cutting-edge, patented blood pressure medication. The active pharmaceutical ingredient might be synthesized in a specialized biochemical facility in India or Ireland.
Okay.
It is then shipped to the United States to be pressed into pills, packaged, and distributed. If the executive branch slaps a 100% ad valorem duty rate on that imported API, it means they are taxing the chemical based on its full assessed value at the border.
Wow. So if the raw chemical shipment is valued at, say, $10 million, the importer of record owes the U.S. government another $10 million just to bring it on shore?
Exactly. And corporate history shows us that pharmaceutical companies do not simply absorb catastrophic margin hits out of the goodness of their hearts. That cost gets passed down the supply chain.
Obviously.
It hits the wholesaler, the pharmacy, the insurance premiums, and ultimately the patient. If you are taking a specialized medication that falls into that 53% of foreign-produced drugs, that medication just became a target for a 100% tax.
Which goes back to the pharmacist scenario we started with.
Right. The document mentions this will spur $400 billion in new domestic investment, which is the long-term intent. But the immediate short-term mechanism is a brutal price shock.
But wait, here's where we have to look closely at the fine print, because the press release framing omits a massive corporate loophole. The PR highlights that this is an ironclad wall protecting Americans.
Yeah, that's what it claims.
But the actual legal proclamation reveals that the tariff is entirely conditional. It's a pressure tactic. Clause 3E states that if a pharmaceutical company agrees to a most favored nation, or MFN, pricing deal directly with the Department of Health and Human Services, and they agree to an onshoring plan approved by the Secretary of Commerce, their tariff drops from 100% to 0%.
All the way to zero.
And that exemption lasts until January 20th, 2029.
Mechanically, what is an MFN pricing deal? It means the pharmaceutical company legally agrees to sell the drug in the United States at a price no higher than the lowest price they charge in any other comparable developed nation, say Germany or Japan, which often have strict state-run price controls.
Oh, I see.
So the executive branch is using the threat of a 100% tariff to artificially import foreign price controls into the American market.
It's like a bouncer at an incredibly exclusive club. The 100% tariff is the heavy velvet rope keeping everyone out. It looks impenetrable from the street. But the 0% exemption is the secret backdoor. If you are a VIP corporation and you walk around the alley and make a private direct deal with the owner of the club, in this case the executive branch, you walk right in for free.
That's exactly what it is.
It fundamentally shifts the American free market into a system of managed, bespoke corporate agreements brokered entirely by the president's cabinet.
It is a profound shift in the mechanics of trade. And we have to analyze who actually possesses the leverage in this scenario. Like, who benefits? Massive multinational pharmaceutical corporations. They have armies of lawyers, massive capital reserves, and the logistical bandwidth to sit down with the Department of Health and Human Services and negotiate these incredibly complex MFN treaties.
They can afford the lawyers and the compliance.
Exactly. They can afford to draft onshoring plans and maintain their market access at a 0% tariff.
And who gets hurt by this mechanism?
Potentially smaller pharmaceutical innovators. Startups who manufacture a single highly effective drug but lack the capital to immediately build a factory in Ohio or negotiate a bespoke treaty with the Secretary of Commerce, they get hit with the 100% tariff.
Right.
But more importantly, the patients get hurt. What happens if a foreign company simply refuses to play ball? Maybe the margins don't make sense for them to onshore complex biochemical manufacturing in a matter of months.
Yeah, they might just walk away.
They decide the American market isn't worth the MFN price cut plus the factory build. So the 100% tariff stays. The resulting environment could effectively create a dual-tier healthcare system. The very wealthy might still be able to afford the doubled price of imported patented treatments out of pocket, but the average citizen loses access to critical healthcare because the foreign company wouldn't sign the executive branch's deal.
But wait, I want to push back on that a bit. Because when I read the accompanying press release, it explicitly says they are protecting the most critical specialty products. It says orphan drugs, drugs for animal health, nuclear medicines, and plasma-derived therapies are going to see a 0% tariff. Doesn't that prove the administration built in safety valves to protect the most vulnerable populations who rely on those highly specialized, rare disease medications?
It is a completely fair point, and it perfectly illustrates why we cannot rely on the PR summary. We have to read the actual plumbing of the proclamation.
What's the plumbing say?
Yes, Clause 3 of the legal text lists those specialty items. But then it adds a crucial conditional clause. It says those specialized drugs are only exempt provided that the Secretary of Commerce determines they are products of a jurisdiction with a current or forthcoming trade agreement, or they meet an urgent United States health need.
Wait, so it's not a blanket medical exemption?
No, it is a highly subjective loophole left entirely to the discretion of political appointees. An orphan drug that keeps a child alive is only tariff-free if the country manufacturing it is in the administration's good graces on an entirely unrelated trade and security framework.
Oh, wow.
Or if an unelected cabinet secretary personally decrees that specific drug an urgent need. The PR paints it as a blanket, compassionate protection for the vulnerable. The legal text reveals it as just another geopolitical bargaining chip. The health of the patient is secondary to the leverage of the trade deal.
That is a staggering realization when you connect it to real-world healthcare access. And, what's fascinating here is that we see this exact same dynamic, this stark gap between the populist PR framing of helping the working class and the structural reality of massive corporate benefits in the tax code documents. Let's pivot to the Working Families Tax Cuts release.
Oh, this is a masterclass in legislative messaging versus economic mechanics.
Right. The headline screams about delivering historic relief. It touts that average tax refunds are up 11%, over $3,700 for the year. And it heavily promotes the no tax on overtime provision, which it claims is helping 20 million essential workers, alongside a no tax on ticks provision for 4.6 million service workers.
Which sounds great.
Yeah, and I have to play devil's advocate here. Isn't $3,700 for a working-class family fundamentally life-changing? If you are a waitress keeping all your tips, or a factory worker pulling overtime to pay rent, why should you care about the rest of the bill as long as you get that direct financial relief?
The direct financial relief is absolutely real, and for a family living paycheck to paycheck, an extra $3,700 or keeping untaxed overtime is immensely beneficial. We can't pretend otherwise.
Right.
It is a tangible, highly visible mechanism that puts cash directly into the pockets of regular Americans. We cannot discount that effect. However, our job is to analyze the entire legal architecture. We have to look at the sheer scale of the numbers hidden further down in that exact same press release because it reveals the true center of gravity for this legislation.
So where does the real money go?
Well, while the document leads with the waitress and the factory worker, the text quietly outlines the corporate provisions. It mentions that the legislation includes a $100 billion with a B retroactive research and development deduction for tens of thousands of businesses.
$100 billion.
Yeah. It also permanently extends the 20% qualified business income deduction, which is Section 199A of the tax code, delivering an average of $400 to $600 to 8 million entrepreneurs. And it allows for full, immediate expensing so companies can write off massive capital investments instantly rather than depreciating them over years.
Let's break down that $100 billion retroactive R&D deduction. What does that actually mean mechanically for a corporation?
Under previous tax laws, specifically Section 174, companies often had to amortize or spread out their research and development costs over 5 years for domestic research or 15 years for foreign research.
Oh.
This new legislation allows them to retroactively deduct those costs all at once. If a massive tech conglomerate spent $1 billion on R&D 3 years ago, they can now retroactively claim that massive deduction against their current tax liability, essentially wiping out their tax bill and getting a massive influx of capital from the government.
The deceptive wording is incredible. They branded the entire legislative package the Working Families Tax Cuts.
Right. The branding is entirely focused on the individual.
But when you look at the raw mathematical scale in the text, the sheer volume of financial relief is heavily weighted toward corporate entities and business owners. Like, Giving a few $1,000s to a worker on overtime is fantastic for that specific family, but mathematically, it is a drop in the ocean compared to handing $100 billion in retroactive deductions to corporate research departments.
Absolutely.
They are using the working class as the public relations shield, the friendly face of the bill, to deliver massive structural, generational financial benefits to the wealthy and to large corporations.
And this ties right back into the metals tariffs, which were released simultaneously. Proclamation 19962 and the related updates put a 50% tariff on the full customs value of imported steel, aluminum, and copper.
50%.
Yeah, and they also put a 25% tariff on derivative products, things made out of those metals. The stated intent is to force domestic metal foundries to increase their capacity utilization up to 80%. They want America making its own steel again.
Which, again, sounds like a great populist talking point.
Yes. But look at the mechanism designed to achieve it. To build those new American factories, corporations need industrial equipment. So the administration built in a carve-out. They are giving a lower 15% tariff rate on metal-intensive industrial equipment and electrical grid equipment through 2027.
Oh, I see where this is going.
So let's trace the causality. The massive corporation building the factory gets a tax break on the imported equipment they need to build it. They also get massive retroactive R&D tax write-offs from the working families bill. But what about the consumer?
Well, if you're listening to this, think about the last time you bought anything containing aluminum or steel. A new car, a smartphone, a refrigerator, even a canned beverage at the grocery store.
Exactly. Because the underlying raw material now carries a 50% import tax, the cost of manufacturing every single one of those consumer goods skyrockets. The corporation isn't going to eat that 50% margin hit.
No, they pass it down the supply chain.
So the consumer, the very same working-class family who just got their $3,700 tax refund, eventually pays hidden taxes at the cash register for any good that contains metal, effectively draining the benefit of the tax cut right back out of their pocket.
It is a brilliantly constructed closed loop. The administration gets the political credit for the tax refund, the corporations get billions in structural write-offs and tariff carve-outs, and the everyday American unknowingly subsidizes the entire operation through inflated retail prices.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what we are witnessing is the administration's mastery of economic leverage. They are using the threat of tariffs and the promise of tax write-offs as absolute weapons to mold corporate behavior. But the administration isn't just doing this in the realm of global trade or federal tax codes. They're turning this exact same mechanism inward.
And that brings us to the next massive area of focus in these documents. We've seen how they use economic levers on corporations, but now we are seeing them use federal funding as a domestic weapon to enforce compliance at the state and local levels.
This is a huge shift.
Yeah, they are aggressively pushing into areas that are normally completely outside federal jurisdiction, like the administration of local elections and the rules of college sports.
We have to look very carefully at the constitutional architecture here. Let's examine the Ensuring Citizenship Verification and Integrity in Federal Elections Executive Order. The intent of this document is to completely overhaul how mail-in ballots and voter registration are handled nationwide.
The mechanisms they outline are incredibly specific. The executive order mandates that the United States Postal Service must adopt and enforce the use of unique intelligent mail barcodes for all mail-in and absentee ballots.
Right.
Furthermore, it forces the Department of Homeland Security to utilize the SAVE database, which stands for the Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements Program, along with Social Security death records, to generate a federal state citizenship list 60 days before every election. And they are mandating that states must reconcile their own voter rolls with this federal list.
This is perhaps one of the most legally complex and potentially unconstitutional documents in the entire stack. We need to dissect the mechanics of what they are demanding. First, let's look at the United States Constitution, specifically Article 1, Section 4, often called the Elections Clause.
Okay.
It states that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. Congress can make or alter regulations, but historically, the administration of elections, the printing of ballots, the maintenance of voter rolls is an intensely guarded state power.
Right. So a state like Colorado or Georgia has its own Secretary of State who manages how their ballots look and how they are mailed.
Exactly. So for the executive branch, not Congress passing a law, but the president issuing a memo to order the USPS to effectively reject or refuse to transmit state-issued ballots if they don't have a specific federally mandated barcode is a massive legal flag.
Yeah, that's wild.
It is the federal government dictating the exact physical parameters of a state's election material. But the second mechanism, the SAVE database mandate, is where the technical friction really occurs.
Explain the SAVE database to me. How does that actually work?
SAVE is a database operated by United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. It is primarily designed for government agencies to check the immigration status of individuals applying for public benefits, things like Medicaid or a driver's license. It is not, and has never been, a comprehensive database of all United States citizens.
Right, because most people never have to use it.
Millions of natural-born U.S. citizens are not in the SAVE database because they have never interacted with the immigration system.
So if a state uses this federal list to purge their voter rolls, they could accidentally purge legitimate natural-born citizens simply because those citizens don't show up in an immigration database.
Precisely. And what's remarkable is that the administration knows this. If you read Section 2A of the actual executive order, it literally admits an individual's identification on the state citizenship list does not indicate that the individual has been properly registered to vote in the state. State and federal laws and state procedures must still be followed.
Wait, the document itself admits that its own federally generated list doesn't equal voter registration?
Yes, it does.
Then what is the actual point of demanding states use it? The press release for the Civ America Act claims that lax verification is a massive national security threat, implying rampant non-citizen voting. But the legal text basically admits the tool they are forcing states to use is flawed.
This is where we analyze intent versus effect. The effect of the mandate seems to be heavily weighted towards symbolic political theater designed to project an image of election integrity to the administration's base. However, the enforcement mechanism they've attached to it has very real, very dangerous teeth. Section 5 of the order directs the Attorney General to evaluate state compliance. If a state refuses to use the federal barcode or reconcile with the flawed CV database list, the Attorney General is directed to withhold federal funding.
This is the crucial mechanism. The administration knows it likely cannot constitutionally force a state to run its election a certain way via executive order. If they just sued a state, the Supreme Court would likely point to Article 1, Section 4.
Exactly.
So instead of a legal mandate, they use financial extortion, they use the power of the purse, they threaten to withhold millions in Department of Justice grants funds that states use for local law enforcement, victim assistance, and public safety if the state doesn't voluntarily comply with the federal election mandate.
It is a devastatingly effective workaround of constitutional limits. You don't have to change the law if you can simply bankrupt the state for not complying with your suggestion.
And we see this exact same strategy leveraging unrelated federal funding to force compliance in entirely separate jurisdictions in one of the most surprising documents in the stack, the Urgent National Action to Save College Sports Executive Order.
This document requires a massive leap in jurisdictional logic. Let's examine what the text says.
Okay, so the administration is unilaterally mandating a 5-year eligibility limit for all college athletes. It is setting strict federal rules on how and when a player can transfer between schools. It explicitly bans what it calls fraudulent NIL, name, image, and likeness schemes, where boosters effectively pay players to come to their schools.
And how exactly does the federal government enforce the roster management of a 19-year-old point guard transferring from Kentucky to Duke?
Right. This is where the mechanism gets truly wild. The text states they are directing federal agencies to evaluate whether violations of these new sports rules render a university unfit for federal grants and contracts.
We have to unpack the aha moment hidden in this document. Why would the White House choose federal grants as the leverage point for college football?
Yeah, it seems so disconnected.
Well, the administration knows the federal government cannot legally regulate the NCAA or college conferences directly via executive order. It's private entertainment and local education. But the administration recognized a structural reality. Modern universities are no longer just schools. Many of them operate like massive, multi-billion-dollar research hedge funds that are completely dependent on federal life support.
The EO explicitly cites the financial numbers, actually. It notes that university athletic departments are drowning in an out-of-control financial arms race. It points to one major athletic program with $535 million in debt and another with $437 million.
Huge numbers.
The administration argues that this insane spending on football facilities and collective payouts threatens to bankrupt the athletic departments, which would lead to the defunding of women's and Olympic sports under Title IX.
So to save these women's and Olympic sports, the executive branch steps in. But look at the specific federal funds they threaten to withhold. The IZA targets research contractors for the Department of War handling advanced robotics or aerospace defense contracts, and medical research contractors for the Department of Health and Human Services who are conducting cancer trials and neurological research.
That is an incredibly vast leap in jurisdiction. How do they legally justify bridging a sports roster to a military contract? Like, how does a rule about a college quarterback improperly taking money from a car dealership impact a university's ability to conduct clinical trials for leukemia?
Legally, they justify it by classifying the entire university as a single entity receiving federal funds. But practically, it sets a terrifying precedent. The executive branch is claiming the authority to micromanage any local institution's behavior by holding its entirely unrelated essential survival funds hostage.
That's terrifying.
If a university's athletic booster club engages in what a political appointee defines as an improper financial activity, the administration is threatening to instantly pull the funding for the biology department's cancer trial. They are holding the cause of higher education and medical advancement hostage over the behavior of sports agents.
Here's where it gets really interesting regarding the expansion of federal power. In Section 4 of the document, the IAO demands the creation of a National Student-Athlete Agent Registry.
Yeah.
The federal government is effectively demanding to become the Human Resources Department for college sports. They are directing the Federal Trade Commission to regulate local sports agents and the Department of Education to rigorously track roster spots and athletic aid by gender.
The irony is palpable. This is an administration that routinely uses rhetoric about deregulation, shrinking the administrative state, and getting the federal government out of local affairs. Yet in this specific instance, the executive order creates an incredibly dense, highly bureaucratic web of federal compliance for university athletics, backed by the nuclear threat of losing billions in scientific research dollars.
So I have to ask you about the practical effect. If the explicit stated goal of the text is to save women's and Olympic sports from being defunded by out-of-control football programs, does threatening the entire university's federal research budget actually help those female athletes?
Based on the structural mechanics of university finance, it almost certainly achieves the exact opposite.
Really?
Let's play out the causality. If a university loses a $100 million HHS grant because a football collective violated a federal rule, the university suffers a massive, immediate financial shock. They suddenly have a massive hole in their operating budget. How do universities historically respond to budget crises?
They cut programs.
Exactly. They cut non-revenue generating departments. They wouldn't cut the football team that brings in television revenue. They would immediately cut the volleyball team, the track and field program, the swimming team. The very women's and Olympic sports the order claims to protect would be the first casualties of the federal defunding.
It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet in a house by threatening to bulldoze the entire foundation.
It is the ultimate blunt instrument. We've seen how they use the power of the purse to force compliance withholding DOJ funds from states over elections, withholding HHS grants from universities over sports. But the ultimate constraint on any president is that Congress actually holds the purse strings.
Right? Article I gives the legislative branch the power to appropriate funds.
So what happens when the administration decides they don't need Congress's permission to spend that money at all?
That brings us to one of the most constitutionally significant moments in this entire stack of documents, the Department of Homeland Security shutdown and the battle between the power of the pen and the power of the purse.
Let's examine the historical context and the mechanics of a government shutdown. When Congress fails to pass an appropriations bill, the Anti-Deficiency Act kicks in. This is a law that prevents federal agencies from incurring obligations or spending money that hasn't been explicitly authorized by Congress.
So people don't get paid.
Essential workers like TSA agents or Border Patrol are required to work without pay until the shutdown ends.
And according to the memos in front of us, in the spring of 2026, we are looking at a brutal 45-day shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security. 60,000 Transportation Security Administration and IC employees, plus 35,000 Coast Guard, FEMA, and cybersecurity personnel are going without paychecks.
It's a massive crisis.
Airport lines are stretching into the parking lots. The system is buckling.
And in response, the president issues a memorandum to unilaterally pay the TSA and ICE employees by moving funds around, entirely bypassing the stalled Congress. But before we look at the funding mechanism, we have to look closely at the legal architecture of the document itself. It is titled, officially in the Federal Record, Liberating the Department of Homeland Security from the Democrat-Caused Shutdown.
I mean, just pause and look at that phrasing. That is the actual title of a binding presidential memorandum. We are seeing blatant political campaign language, Democrat-caused shutdown, directly copy-pasted into the permanent legal architecture of the United States government.
Unprecedented.
The aggressive rhetoric isn't just confined to the press releases anymore. It has fully infected the legal codes.
It fundamentally blurs the line between governance and campaigning to a degree that is highly unusual for formal executive memoranda. The text is weaponized. But beyond the highly partisan wording, we must zero in on the plumbing of the funding mechanism because it represents a staggering constitutional flag.
Right. In this memo, the president states, I hereby direct the Secretary of Homeland Security, direct the Secretary of Homeland Security to use funds that have a reasonable and logical nexus to the functions of DHS to provide each and every employee of DHS with the compensation and benefits that would have accrued to them.
A reasonable and logical nexus. That is the master key the administration is using to pick the lock on the Treasury.
So.
Let's explain 31 U.S.C. 1301A. In plain English, this is the law that says the government can only spend money on exactly what Congress authorized. You cannot take money appropriated for building a highway and use it to buy fighter jets. But the executive branch is claiming the authority to direct the Office of Management and Budget to scour the federal ledgers, find unappropriated funds or funds appropriated for something loosely related, and reroute them to pay TSA salaries during a shutdown.
Just based on a nexus.
Right. They justify this simply by declaring an emergency situation compromising the nation's security.
So the president is basically saying, I declare this an emergency, therefore I can move the money wherever I see a logical connection, regardless of what Congress passed.
Yes. It is a staggering workaround of the congressional power of the purse. The OMB is physically bypassing the locked Treasury door by redefining how money is apportioned during a crisis.
Now, I have to play the proxy for the listener here. If you were a TSA agent who hasn't been able to pay rent for 6 weeks, or a family who spent 12 hours sleeping on the floor of an airport trying to get home, you don't care about the Anti-Deficiency Act.
No, you absolutely don't.
You care that the airport's open. And the PR release titled President Trump Acts Where Democrats Refused proves that this move absolutely worked in the short term. The document quotes CNN, the Associated Press, and local news stations in Baltimore and New Orleans confirming that the miserably long airport lines eased, absenteeism dropped, and travelers were able to move safely once the paychecks were promised. Didn't the president objectively solve the crisis?
This is exactly why executive overreach can be so incredibly politically popular. The immediate effect is highly beneficial and highly visible. The airport lines go down, the TSA worker feeds their family. The president looks like a decisive hero cutting through legislative red tape. But as analysts, we must consider the long-term structural effect on the government's machinery.
Right.
It represents a massive consolidation of financial power in the Oval Office.
How does it change the balance of power permanently?
Consider the precedent. The primary leverage Congress has over the president is the threat of withholding money. If a president knows they can simply declare a national emergency, find a reasonable nexus in other accounts, and unilaterally fund their preferred agencies during a shutdown, why would they ever negotiate with Congress again?
They wouldn't need to.
Exactly. The legislative branch essentially loses its primary constitutional tool forever. The president can rule by memo, fund whatever they deem a priority, and completely sideline the representatives elected by the people.
And speaking of bypassing Congress to handle national security priorities, the administration doesn't just use this absolute unilateral language for domestic funding. They use it for literal war.
Yes. Operation Epic Fury.
Let's look at the transcripts regarding Operation Epic Fury, which is detailed in the documents as a massive, overwhelming military campaign against Iran.
The framing of this operation is absolute. It is not presented as a measured strategic strike. It is presented as total annihilation.
In his primetime address, the president states, "Tonight, Iran's navy is gone, their air force is in ruins," and he goes on to say, "Their ability to launch missiles and drones is dramatically curtailed, and their weapons, factories, and rocket launchers are being blown to pieces." The rhetoric claims total victory within 4 weeks.
That's a massive claim.
But what I find fascinating is how the administration justifies this massive overseas conflict to the American public.
They don't justify it purely on abstract geopolitical strategy or human rights. They tie it directly, viscerally, to domestic economic pain. The president explicitly addresses the sudden rise in gasoline prices across the United States. He blames it entirely on Iran launching terror attacks against commercial oil tankers, stating, "This short-term increase has been entirely the result of the Iranian regime."
He's telling the American consumer, you are paying more at the pump because of them, so I destroyed them.
Exactly.
But then he pivots to the foreign allies who apparently didn't join the U.S. in the attack and are now struggling to get fuel. He essentially tells them to go pillage the ruins. He says, build up some delayed courage and then go to the strait and just take it, protect it, use it for yourselves. Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part is done. He is actively encouraging allied nations to just take Iranian oil by force.
It is a radically transactional, almost mercantile view of geopolitics and military power. We broke their military, so go take their natural resources. And it is entirely driven by this singular unilateral vision of executive authority.
It really is.
These military transcripts, combined with the domestic economic policies, show an administration that believes it possesses the total, unquestioned mandate to reshape global trade, rewrite tax law, mandate state election rules, govern university biology labs, fund shutdown agencies, and wage overwhelming war, all with minimal to zero input from the legislative branch or international coalitions.
There is a specific detail in the Epic Fury press release that perfectly encapsulates this mindset. When discussing previous administrations and the failures of the Iran nuclear deal, the president doesn't offer a complex diplomatic analysis. He simply states, they made mistakes and I am correcting them. It's an assertion of absolute correctness.
It's the language of a sovereign, not a public servant.
So what does this all mean for the limits of power? If an administration can move money with a reasonable nexus to bypass Congress and launch massive military operations like Epic Fury while openly telling allies to take foreign oil as the spoils of war, where does the text say these executive powers actually end?
That is the most revealing part of reading these primary sources. Based strictly on this stack of documents, the text doesn't acknowledge an end to those powers.
Wow.
The limits only exist if another branch of government, the courts or Congress, manages to successfully force a limit. The text operates on the assumption of maximum unchecked authority. And this raises an important question. How are these vast structural changes to the American Republic communicated to the public? Because if the government is shifting its source code this dramatically, you have to control the narrative so the public accepts it.
Which brings us to our final area of analysis, the rhetoric of reality. This is where we examine the documents focused purely on culture, symbolism, and messaging. This is how the administration curates its own reality and bypasses the traditional press. Let's look at the press release titled, President Trump Ended Democrats' Transgender for Everybody Insanity.
We must impartially assess the language and the structural impact here. The text uses highly charged, aggressive, disparaging wording to describe a specific demographic of American citizens. It relies on terms like mutilation, delusion, un-American indoctrination, and radical leftist ideology.
The rhetoric is very intense.
But we have to look past the rhetoric and analyze the physical mechanism of the policy. The administration is using the official apparatus and funding power of the United States government to mandate massive shifts in healthcare access and federal recognition.
And the document boasts about the devastating effectiveness of this strategy. It proudly states that dozens of major healthcare hospitals, institutions like Kaiser Permanente, Denver Health, Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, and Stanford Medicine have completely ceased or suspended their gender-affirming care programs.
And why do they do that?
Because the administration threatened to strip them of their federal funding if they continued these practices. It also proudly notes they ended the practice of allowing gender self-identification on federal documents like passports.
Let's analyze the tangible structural effect of this directive. While the document frames this entirely under the populist banner of protecting children and restoring biological truth, the undeniable real-world effect is the immediate, sweeping removal of healthcare access, the cessation of federal funding for specific medical programs, and the erasure of official federal recognition for an entire demographic.
It's a huge impact on dignity and basic rights for those individuals.
Exactly. It shifts the federal apparatus from a neutral arbiter of identity and access to an active partisan enforcer of strict biological definitions. If your hospital doesn't comply with the administration's ideological mandate, they lose their ability to operate. It is the weaponization of federal grants, exactly like we saw with the college sports EO, but applied to human rights and medical care.
It is entirely coercive. And we see a similar ideological tightrope being walked in the proclamation for Education and Sharing Day USA 2026. On the surface, this document is a lovely historical tribute honoring the life and legacy of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, a deeply revered Jewish leader.
Yes, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a figure of immense historical, educational, and religious importance.
But look closely at how the document pivots. Right after praising the rabbi's legacy of education, the text suddenly shifts gears into a highly political attack on the current American school system. It states, "We are bringing back common sense to our classrooms and ending left-wing indoctrination of our students."
The deceptive wording in this section is glaring because it contains a massive structural contradiction. In the exact same paragraph, the text claims, "We are removing educational control from the hands of unelected bureaucrats and returning it to the states, local communities, and parents to whom it rightly belongs."
How can the federal government simultaneously mandate the end of left-wing indoctrination, which requires a centralized federal definition of what constitutes acceptable thought and curriculum, while also claiming to return total control to local communities?
Mechanically, it is impossible. You cannot have absolute local control and strict federal ideological mandates at the same time. The implicit message behind the wording is clear. Local control is only permitted and only celebrated if the local community happens to agree with the federal executive branch's ideology.
So if they disagree.
If a local school board in a liberal city uses their local control to teach what the administration deems left-wing indoctrination, the administration will not respect their autonomy. They will step in and crush it, likely by threatening federal education funding. It is conditional freedom.
They curate the narrative of freedom while maintaining the mechanism of control. And while we are talking about curating narratives, we have to look at the press release from First Lady Melania Trump's office regarding the reunification of Ukrainian children.
Let's analyze the scale and framing of this document. The PR announces that 6 Ukrainian minors are being returned to their families from Russia, with a 7th arriving later. Reuniting children with their families in a war zone is objectively a positive humanitarian act. It is a good thing.
But look at how it is packaged. The PR frames the reunification of single-digit individuals, literally 6 children, as a major, headline-grabbing geopolitical triumph orchestrated by the First Lady's diplomatic prowess. In the middle of a massive, grinding global war where tens of thousands of children have been displaced, bombed, or kidnapped, issuing an official White House press release celebrating the return of 6 kids is textbook political theater.
It is designed to generate positive, compassionate, human interest headlines that mask the brutal, complex realities of the broader geopolitical situation. It provides a heartwarming anecdote to distract from the devastating scale of the conflict.
It's misdirection. You are meant to look at the 6 children being saved, or the beautiful tribute to a revered rabbi, while massive structural changes to civil rights, healthcare access, trade law, and military policy are quietly cemented into place offstage.
That's the reality.
And the administration knows exactly how to control the stage, right down to the device in your pocket. Let's look at the final document, the launch of the new official White House app.
The press release for the app is incredibly revealing about how this administration views information. It promises to deliver unfiltered, real-time updates straight from the source. It allows users to watch live streams of the president, get breaking news alerts, and stay connected on policy breakthroughs directly from the administration's communications team.
By creating this closed-loop media ecosystem, they are bypassing traditional journalism entirely. Think about everything we've uncovered today. The blending of political campaign attacks into binding legal memos. The selective framing of the working families' tax cuts that actually deliver $100 billion to corporations.
Right, the hidden mechanics.
The hidden mechanisms of the 100% tariffs that will double the price of your medication. With this app, the administration ensures that their curated version of reality reaches the listener's pocket without a single ounce of journalistic friction, context, or fact-checking.
It creates a reality where the administration's stated intent is automatically accepted as the real-world effect. If the app sends a push notification saying the new tariffs are saving America, the user believes it because they never see the fine print about the MFN loophole or the massive markup on their cancer medication. The app becomes the single source of truth.
And I noticed one final detail, heavily present in the footers and headings of all these documents. They are constantly branding their initiatives like products. We see Freedom 250, Working Families Tax Cuts, and most noticeably, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. How does this constant branding of federal paperwork change the nature of the government itself?
It commodifies the government. It turns federal policy into a lifestyle brand. When an executive order isn't just a dry legal directive, but a branded product labeled DOGE delivered directly to your smartphone via an unfiltered app, the line between governance, marketing, and propaganda dissolves completely.
It becomes a product launch.
Yes, the government ceases to be a public trust operating on behalf of citizens and instead becomes an ongoing, highly stylized political campaign selling a product to consumers.
So, bringing all these threads together, we have spent this time reading past the PR spin, lifting the floorboards of this stack of 2026 documents, and a remarkably clear picture has emerged of how the government plumbing is being rewired. We are seeing an administration utilizing the absolute razor-edge limits of executive power.
We really are.
Whether it's using 100% tariffs to force multinational corporate deals under the guise of national security, threatening university medical research grants to control the transfer rules of college football, or bypassing a congressional shutdown with creative emergency declarations to pay favored agencies, the text reveals a government reshaping American life unilaterally.
Furthermore, our analysis shows that policies branded with populist titles like Help for the Working Family carry massive, embedded, billions of dollars deep benefits for corporations and the wealthy. We've seen that cultural initiatives are enforced with unapologetic, deeply partisan mandates that severely impact healthcare access and civil rights for minority populations, all while contradictorily claiming to champion local control.
It is an incredible consolidation of power executed through the hidden mechanisms of tariffs, tax codes, and the relentless weaponization of federal grants.
It truly is. And it leaves us with a final reflection to mull over. When the legal architecture of a nation begins to rely less on laws debated, compromised on, and passed by a representative legislature,
Right.
and more on the creative interpretation of emergency powers, funding technicalities, and unmediated apps controlled by a single office,
Yeah.
the fundamental nature of how a republic operates has shifted beneath our feet. We may still call it a democracy, but the source code of the nation has been entirely rewritten.
It makes you wonder, if the source code has been altered this deeply and the new system is built entirely on executive leverage, how long until the citizens realize they are no longer participants in a republic, but simply subjects of a managed reality?